Jen, do you want to kick us off? Do you want
Sure.
me to kick it off?
Absolutely. What are some of the best takeaways from today? I think is a great question to start off with. And please, everybody, feel free to answer questions.
Yeah.
Ask questions and answer them in chat.
It is a conversation after all.
I think one of the biggest takeaways here, even perhaps more so than last year, is that as much as I think there was a humbleness to kind of the research, and there's a statement that I'm hearing that while there's so much research and we're moving ahead, we still really don't know what misophonia is. We still don't really know what causes it, and we don't really know how to treat it yet. I feel just so much empathy coming from all of the researchers and some of the clinicians and people who are also researchers and clinicians. And I think that's really great to see. So that's one of my takeaways. And there's a greater understanding of misophonia, of the experiences of those with misophonia than I felt was coming across last year. Anyone else?
I'll jump in for the first kind of opening comment. Yeah, I agree with that, Jen. I also think that we are seeing that some of what is being found in the science of misophonia as it advances is, I think, really importantly, telling us about its complexity. And that I think in some ways it makes sense that the first maybe 7, 8, 9 years of misophonia research, because there was so little of it and there was such little funding for it, it just didn't tell us a lot. It got us started, but we're now, I think, in this next phase of science where we're starting to just use a little bit more rigorous methods. There's more people doing it, and we're seeing that it really is complex. And there's a lot of variability. So when we talked, for example, about treatment and strategies, we talked about underlying features this morning and this afternoon. And what strikes me is the incredible variability across people with misophonia, that there just might be tremendous variability in the nature and the features, the causes, the maintaining factors. This is just not a cookie cutter kind of thing. That seems really, I think, even clearer to me today than a year ago when we did this.
I'll go ahead and speak up since we're wrapping up. I was silent because I was trying to figure out how to get Jane into the meeting. I really liked some of the new information that was presented. I personally really liked Dr. Sumner's, even though it was sort of a prevalence on the impact of misophonia that it has on people's lives. I know that might have been an uncomfortable conversation for people to have, but one of my big things as somebody with misophonia is just how much it impacts our lives and how stressful it is to have every day in every situation. And I appreciated that study being done, even though it may not have been the big overwhelming treatment thing that everybody wanted to hear. I really appreciated that study.
Okay. So just a couple questions. Let's see. Oh, so someone is asking, Cris, could you please ask all the professionals in attendance to ask Cris to add their names to soQuiet's provider list? Maybe we want to talk about resources a little bit and what a person can do. Maybe they read something and they go, oh gosh, that's me. I have misophonia. Where do I go? What do I do?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. It's with the prevalence studies that we have, we know there are many, many, many people who have symptoms of misophonia to a moderate or great degree. And the number of clinicians who know what it is and can see those kinds of clients is very small right now. And that's a big bottleneck right now.
I think one of the challenges with that I encounter as a psychologist who talks to a lot of other clinicians about misophonia, trying to raise awareness and kind of help them understand what they're seeing, is that I think at least, I think this is maybe particularly true in the mental health space. Maybe this is just my experience, but there's oftentimes this experience where the provider that I'm talking to about misophonia thinks that they can't help because they aren't experts. And so they assume that there must be this kind of group of experts out there that are the right people. And until there are experts and there is a kind of proven, a proven treatment that everybody can get in a cookie cutter way, then they can't help. And I think that, I just think it's, I kind of reject that. I kind of think like, actually there aren't a lot of experts. There might be no experts. Maybe the only experts are the people who really experience this. And that's just where we are in the early stage of things. But that doesn't therefore mean that there is nothing that can possibly help anyone. I don't think the logical conclusion to that is just sheer and utter paralysis or hopelessness. Although I respect that people who have had experiences where they tried certain treatments and it's not benefited, I totally understand and really feel for them that would lead to this sense of paralysis and hopelessness. I talk to them every day and I get it, I feel it. But I think there's ways we can help clinicians without them having to feel like they're the expert. I think there's ways we can help them use things that are reasonable, that are flexible, that are principled, that they might already know how to do in certain ways. We have to help them realize that misophonia is not just simply another disorder in disguise. It's really complicated, and it's got a lot of underlying parts that, we have to help people figure out what are those parts for them, what are their patterns, what are their individual kinds of challenges that they particularly see in their life in certain contexts that they want to overcome. And then how can we, again, speaking to at least to the mental health providers, how can we take what we already know works well for those kinds of underlying biopsychosocial processes across lots of diagnoses? And how can we use those in just a very personalized, collaborative, patient empowering way? That's kind of what we strive to do. And I think that is doable. I feel hopeful that is something that can be done.
I agree.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just want to say that, I've been humbled by my experience working with misophonia for the last few years. When I went into my research fellowship, I had some ideas that I was fairly sure were going to be correct. And I'm finding the opposite on some of them. And so one of the things that I'm doing when I'm talking to other clinicians is encouraging them to go in with humility as well. And like Zach was saying, that there are lots of strategies that you might use the same sorts of techniques that you use for other problems, but don't expect to get the same results. So go into it with a really open, curious mind and encourage the same in the person with misophonia to be curious about what's going to happen, but don't expect what's going to happen, because that just makes the whole experience worse for the person with misophonia.
Thank you. Lauren also has asked a question. What is the most exciting thing to each of you in regard to misophonia research, and where do you think we will be in 5 years?
My lab is teaching me to wait and not interject first because I have a tendency to jump in. So I'm going to let others go first.
I'm the one person who's not a researcher on the
That's
panel,
why
so
I
I'm not
asked
really
you, Cris.
called. Oh,
What is the most
where
exciting
do I
to
see
you?
misophonia research in 5 years? It's a great question. I'm not sure.
I'll go.
Go ahead.
I think for me is really understanding maybe these subcategories of individuals with misophonia, kind of how we see that misophonia could be a subcategory of hyperacusis, maybe looking at these brain networks that are unique profiles for these subcategories and having studies where we have a certain network and see how it responds to maybe 3 different types of treatment. And having more large-scale studies where we're combining diagnosis with treatment options and being able to profile what's best suited to that particular network. That's where I hope we're heading. I've seen one study that is doing that, and I just think that would be really powerful for treatment in this population.
Thank you. And Dr. CMER has asked, Zach, you've done some work with the National Suicide Hotline, apparently, and she has asked that you would speak about that.
Sure. Real quick. Thanks, Jules. We reached out to 988 people, the national kind of infrastructure for 988 in the U.S., which is the suicide crisis hotline number in the United States. It used to be called the suicide crisis number or something like that. Now it's just called 988. So we reached out to the 988 people, actually in response to some advocacy work that people in the Misosphere had done with us to encourage us and kind of help us recognize that that's a good place to use our influence to try to help change things. It's a really good example of where everybody kind of working together to get something to happen. And they were very responsive. They are very responsive. We and my team are making training materials for them. We've delivered the materials to them. They're planning to roll it out to their staff nationwide. Their staff will be trained in what misophonia is. So the idea will be anybody in the US who calls 988 who's describing something like misophonia, there should be staff now trained on the other end to understand what might be going on. And we've provided some very practical tips around support and validation for people who might be in that circumstance. Can I also answer the previous question too, real quick? Because I'm excited about a lot of things. And for me, really high level, what I'm excited about is we are moving scientifically to what the clinicians and people with misophonia already know, which is that there's variability. This is not a cookie cutter thing. And when there's variability, what excites me is that there are ways to try to help figure out how we can get people to understand their individual patterns, their own variability, which gets to what the possible intervention options will be. And if we can do that well from an assessment standpoint, and we can map onto assessment particular intervention options that are evidence-based and help people collaboratively know what they can choose to do in a way that they really want to do, because the best treatment is the one somebody does. It's not the one that I tell them to do, it's what they choose to do. If we can make that happen, I think there's just tremendous opportunity to help people. And two of the projects we're working on at Duke that I'm really excited about, one is through funding from the Brout family. We are really grateful to be about to begin some advocacy work across the U.S. to raise awareness of misophonia in physicians nationwide. And we're really hoping that we see the needle move. So I'm excited to try to put that needle forward and get much more awareness out there. Every parent should be able to go see a doctor or see a provider and describe what's going on, and the doctor or provider know the word misophonia. That should be for everyone, and it's not right now. I'm excited about trying to change that. Then the other research, the research we're doing, I'm most excited about, I think in 5 years could be a real thing, is we're working with the University of Washington right now to use a semantic hearing platform to literally use AI to take out misophonic triggers from sounds that people hear, but still be able to hear everything else in the environment they're in. So imagine you go into a movie theater and you bring headphones with you and you put them on and you're able to watch the movie and hear everything except for what you pressed on your app, which might be popcorn or soda, ice crunching, or whatever the trigger might be. You can remove that and you will not hear that, but you'll hear everything else. And I think that kind of AI-driven digital health work that can help people in the real world, for me, that is something that personally I'm very, very excited about, that work that we're doing, and we hope will be available in 5 years.
That is really, really exciting. Here's a great question from Adil. How would semantic listening be related to the earlier talk about not having earplugs all the time? So I guess what Adil is asking is, could this reorganize the brain in any way?
That's such a good question. Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
Julie, you take it, please take it. No, please take it.
No, I don't think it would, because you're not introducing any type of auditory deprivation. You're still able to hear everything else going on. You're just not hearing that trigger. So I wouldn't expect it to have any of the effects that we would see, again, with sound deprivation, sound deficit.
One of the things we didn't talk a lot about today were the visual triggers. We talked a little bit about misokinesia in terms of repetitive motor movements that one is looking at. But we didn't talk, a lot of people refer to just visual triggers as misokinesia. And one of the thoughts that was going through my mind all day was, does this, and again, I know we can't answer this, but it would be an interesting thing to think about. Does it start with the auditory and then the visual comes in? Are there separate visual triggers? What do you all think about that, and how can we research that better?
Yeah, I had some thoughts on that, because I think that there's both. I think that there's a separate thing of misokinesia, which is specifically related to movement. But I also think, in my talk, I talk about associative learning, which is when your brain sort of pairs sensory information with some kind of meaning. And so I also think that certain movements get paired with sound. So the visual of eating, you can see that and imagine the sound of eating because it's been paired in your brain with the sound of eating. So when I'm talking to people about whether this is part of their misophonia, I ask that question, like, is this related to a sound that is a problem for you, or does this exist in isolation of a sound? So like for me, if I can see a blinking light in the corner of my eye, that will distract me, and I won't be able to, I'll keep looking at it to see if it's still there, and I won't be able to focus on what I'm doing. And that's not related to any kind of sound thing. But if I can, I will also get distracted by the sight of somebody sort of shaking their leg, but that is also associated with the sound of like a tapping foot or that kind of thing. So yeah, I think both exist.
Does anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, I think we just need a lot more research on that. Yeah, I definitely have triggers that are visual that are not associated with some kind of sound, and I've had those as long as I've experienced misophonia. So I just think we don't know. I'm fascinated to find out what that is.
Well, Dr. Ward's presentation this morning, the first one, really spoke to this directly, I think. Yeah. And his team's work is it's terrific. It's showing that general sensory sensitivity might be that kind of connective hub. He describes it as London in the railway network of the UK. It might be the connective hub that kind of explains a little bit, if not a lot for some people, if not for a lot of people, about kind of why there might be these different sensory sensitivities and which one comes first. Maybe it's different for different people. Maybe there's a sort of generalized sensory sensitivity that's there, and that's really important at a transdiagnostic level. And it might be variable across people or even within people. What particular sensory pieces emerge? Are they tactile, or are they auditory, or are they olfactory, or are they right? And that's all really complicated stuff, but I think it's important to remember that work that his team is doing. I think it's really helpful.
Yeah, and I even experienced what I call vibrational triggers. So if you're sitting in a row of seats at a theater and all the seats are connected, if somebody at one end is doing something and I can feel it but not hear it or see it, it's a trigger, and we don't know anything about that either.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, there's a lot of interesting theories in terms of sensory weights and how much we rely on a certain sense versus others. And I think that we hear a lot about that growing up. Are you an auditory learner? Are you a visual learner? Are you a hands-on learner? So I do think, especially since we see these symptoms come about in adolescence, it would be interesting to see if there's any connection with sensory dominance in terms of how we learn.
That's a really great idea. I hope that gets researched. It also makes me think about how the senses integrate when we think about not just, let's say, audio and visual, but how are they working together? How is tactile and audio working together? So Zach, going back to like Barry Stein's work of this idea of multisensory integration, if one thing is off, there's like a butterfly effect. So thinking more in those terms, maybe that will be some of the next steps in research.
Well, and maybe there's additional transdiagnostic processes that are not specifically or primarily sensory focused, but that we just haven't studied yet. Jen, you and I were talking with Cris about monotropic attention processes in autism, and wow, that's just a whole other idea, a whole other vector to take to think about this. That maybe it's attentional functioning that narrows, and that's a process. It's a process we see in autism. That's a part of autism, and we don't know if that's a part of what's also in misophonia for some people. Maybe the narrowing of attention is not simply just a hypervigilance towards fight flight. Maybe it is for some people, but maybe there's some other kinds of attentional processes in there. That those attentional processes, of course, will intersect with sensory processes and learning and emotion and memory, and it all intersects in a really complicated array of biopsychosocial processes. Sensory sensitivity seems to be really important, but it's probably not the only important piece.
Yeah, and I think that when we're thinking about like the next 5 years of research, I think that's one of the most exciting things is that until research in misophonia started getting funded properly, we had these really small studies that just, all they could do is a few things because they didn't have enough people that they were surveying to be able to ask more questions. And so now we can repeat those studies, add in extra information to work out which things explain other things. We've got all these studies that were done in isolation. When you look at all of those things together, you can then say, okay, these things aren't actually directly related. Like Zach's presentation about PTSD and saying, that they look related because there's some other similarities that might be associated with both of those things, but it's not a direct relationship. And I think that's one of the most exciting things that will come out of research is that the funding is now there to be able to have larger studies, to repeat studies that were done before and start ruling some things out, which will be really helpful as well.
That's such a good point, Jane, because what that does, at least in the US, with the way the NIH does its funding, is that when you approach the NIH, which the National Institutes for Health, when you approach them from the perspective of there's a transdiagnostic set of biologically associated processes, NIH ears will open up. When you approach them and say, we want to study misophonia, their ears close. So what Jane is describing is really important, and it's not just message framing. It really is. It might be more pragmatic, but it really is like we are learning that there are these transdiagnostic processes that are part of misophonia, and my gosh, the variability in there has got to be studied. We got to understand it, and the way to do that is through funding. And funding is hard to get. There hasn't yet been a single research study funded by the NIH in the US with the word misophonia in the title. It hasn't happened yet. We of course want to change that. But this research stuff we're all talking about today, it is really, really expensive to do. And the NIH is really the biggest kind of amount in the US, the biggest amount of funding that one can go for. So that, great point, Jane. That provides us some hope that we'll be able to, we or anybody will be able to get that funding.
That makes me, thank you. That makes me also think about the diagnostic manuals. It seems when I listen to Dr. CMER, Dr. Gregory, they're able to move things a little more quickly. I think about also in Amsterdam, misophonia is considered a diagnosis, and we're slower here in the United States. So maybe either Dr. Campbell or Zach, anyone could speak a little bit about, are there any efforts being made to get misophonia into a diagnostic manual? And what does that process really look like? Because people ask me that all the time.
Julie, you want that one?
You're the expert on that from what we've talked about, but I think it would be personally pretty simple. Well, simple is not the right word. It would be feasible to have this as a diagnostic code along with tinnitus because they're very similar. So I think that would be a feasible thing to do. I think it would be possibly the best route to try initially. But I do know having it in the DSM might be helpful too, and I'll let Zach speak to that part.
So thanks, Julia. I went online as though I was going to propose misophonia to be a new disorder and went to the ICD website and started that process. And quickly learned that in order to execute that process of formally proposing in the ICD that misophonia or anything become its own newly named disorder, you literally have to click on which part, which section, and which subsection you propose that the new disorder be in. So you have to choose. Is it a psychiatric disorder? Is it a musculoskeletal disorder? Well, no, we wouldn't probably say it's a musculoskeletal disorder. But I would imagine if we had a poll up and we had enough time, there would be divergence in this group as to whether people think it should be a psychiatric disorder. It's unknown. Should it be an auditory disorder, as Julie is describing? I think many people might say it should be, but I think there is divergence. Other people would say, no, it should not be. It should be in the DSM. I think anecdotally, I get asked as many times by people, when will it be in the DSM, as I get asked by other people, why do people think it should be in the DSM? And there's just very strong polarized feelings about that. So I think it's tricky. It's really tricky. And ultimately, whether we're talking DSM, which is slated to be 2026 at the earliest, which means it won't be 2026, it'll be well after that, or we're talking ICD, there needs to be, guys, far more really good scientific research, and that means funding. And I want to give a shout out to the Misophonia Research Fund in this moment, because if you were here this morning when I showed the graph of misophonia science increasing like this the last 3 years, we have to say it's due to the Misophonia Research Fund, at least in some, if not large part, providing funding to many of us to be able to do the research. So there needs to be more of that. They're the only entity in the world that provides the funding. We need much more funding to do the much more research to be able to have really any genuinely honest chance to get enough good quality studies done to be able to be in ICD or DSM. That is the reality. We need much more.
That's probably a good place to close, actually. That's a good closing message from a narrative standpoint, if that's right with you all, unless you have some additional things you want to throw in.
I was just going to add one thing. What can people with misophonia or people with misophonia and their family do to push this process forward? How can people who want to advocate, how can they do so in terms of diagnostic manuals and awareness in general?
I think the main thing is just to talk about it as much as possible. I don't think any one person is going to make great waves in any way. I think it's going to be the more that people hear about it, and hear about it in a respectful and open-minded and curious way instead of an aggressive way, which we're all, like, a lot of us have suffered for a really long time. And so the instinct is to be really angry about this, but being aware that people don't listen when they're being spoken to like that. So just talking about it in a respectful way to as many healthcare providers and educators and people as you can, because
I completely agree.
Totally, yeah. Very cool. Anyone else have any closing thoughts before we wrap up this very lovely day that I appreciate all of you being a part of? No? All right. Well, that's it. Second year of CARE down. It's a wrap. Thank you all for your help. Thank you to all of the attendees and to all of the people who presented and moderated and spoke today. Thank you so much. This has been very eye-opening. Hope you all have a great rest of your day. And the videos for this will be posted in the very near future. You'll get an email about that. The force will be with you always. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Cris.